All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code PODCAST5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Over the last decade, Elizabeth Earnshaw has become one of today's most trusted relationship teachers. She's a renowned Gottman therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, clinical fellow at the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and an Instagram influencer who's helped transform countless relationships. She's one of the founders of Ours, where she works to make couples counseling mainstream and accessible. She owns a Better Life Therapy in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, supporting clinicians who are helping couples every day. And released November 30th, 2021, her debut book, I Want This to Work, is a trustworthy, inclusive guide to navigating the most challenging relationship issues we face. Couples will learn how to work through 3 challenges they must tackle to repair and strengthen their relationships: conflict, healing, and connection. Her guide is inclusive to the LGBTQIA+ community and written for both married and unmarried couples. This book brings an accessible guide to healing relationships and creating enduring intimacy. It's such a pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Earnshaw to today's show. Liz, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. I selfishly love to learn everything about how to make a relationship work. Chris and I have been together for 10 years on February 19th. So we met when we were babies, and we have 2 babies. But you just released your new book, I Want This to Work. And I'd love for you to demystify making relationships work. Let's start by talking a little bit about how you got into couples therapy.
Yeah, so I did not know I wanted to be a couples therapist my whole life, which I think obviously makes sense. I don't think there's many of us as like little kids playing with our dolls thinking we're going to be a couples therapist, but I knew I wanted to help people. I actually went to school for organizational psychology. And so I thought I wanted to do like consulting with businesses. I went to school for education, and I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I was terrible at it. And I was at this like crossroads in my life where I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I want to help people, but I don't know what to do with it. And I was driving down a highway, and there was a billboard advertising a couples therapy program. And I was like, oh, I actually think that's what I want to do. That seems really interesting. And I went home and I applied, and it's been history ever since. I've been doing it for over a decade now, but it was something that was not necessarily my path, but because I was lucky enough to see that billboard and get into this program, I realized it's really my calling, and it is my biggest passion in life. And yeah, I've been doing it for over a decade. I've worked with hundreds of couples.
That's so funny, because it's like that meme. If you need a sign, here it is. And like you had that.
I literally got a sign while I was both like metaphorically and actually lost on the road.
Wow. When you started as a couples therapist, were you in a relationship or married?
No. So when I was in school to become a couples, so I was in a program for couples and family therapy. And I actually thought I wanted to be a family therapist. I thought I wanted to work with little kids and their parents. But again, like I just always found myself wanting to be their mommy, the kids' mommies, but not necessarily very good as a teacher or therapist with them, but really good with adults. But when I was going through the program, I was in a super destructive relationship. It was just not healthy. I mean, I thought it was like the moon and the stars, but looking back, I'm like, that was not even a relationship. That was terrible. And being in the program actually helped me to see some of the relationship patterns I was replicating in my adult life that I was really unaware of, that I kind of felt like were normal. And that is a huge part of my passion, is that the only reason I've been able to improve my relationship life is because I went to grad school and I learned all of these things and I spent lots of money and lots of years doing it. And I think that's kind of unfair. And so I'm super passionate about helping people learn those same things that I learned so that they're not in these destructive relationships otherwise.
Oh, so important. I think even some of the people that I follow online now are parenting therapists and relationship therapists, and it's because they're tools. Just like in the nutrition space that I work in, there are tools and strategies to balance your blood sugar. There are tools and strategies to communicate with your partner or your children that create a healthy relationship. And we can all feel those. And I want to go through, because you just wrote this amazing book, I Want This to Work, is that you're giving people these tools and strategies online. And you went to grad school, you spent a bunch of money, but you understand the science of it. You did mention relationship patterns that are destructive. Are there common relationship patterns that you see in your practice and through your work that are destructive that you could go through with us today?
Sure. So there are three really common patterns that people get into when they're stuck in conflict. And the first pattern is called the blame game. And that's when we're just pointing fingers at people, right? So it's, you didn't clean the kitchen today. What's your problem? And the other person says, well, I would have had time to clean the kitchen if you would have been able to get the kids from school on time. And oh, well, I would have gotten the kids from school on time if you would have had their lunches ready. So there's this back and forth finger pointing, which I can relate to.
Yeah. I'm just laughing because Chris is like, we have this inside joke that it's like, well, then it's my fault, right? And I'm like, yes, it's always your fault.
Totally, always.
But it's just like this very teasing a relationship about it, but it can, we just joke about it. So
Totally.
I think it's probably me.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually a really productive way to get out of the blame game, is to use humor. So couples who are good at making fun of themselves tend to not get stuck in these patterns. We all have these patterns, right? I certainly, with Andrew, have had moments where we're just going back and forth and it's so stupid. Like by the end, we're like, what? Where did we even start with this? But he and I use a lot of humor so we get out of it and it's not like a chronic state of our relationship.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some couples don't get out of that. And what then tends to happen is a dynamic called the pursuer distancer dynamic. And this is where one person is kind of pursuing issues, and it might be concerns, problems, frustrations, whatever. And so they're bringing them up, and the other person is shut down from that and they distance. So obviously very frustrating. And I've been in those dynamics too, where I'm saying, please just talk to me. And the other person's saying, it's late. Do we really need to talk right now? Or, oh, you're bringing that up again. I'm done. Or they ignore the text or whatever. And so in that dynamic, it's often a result of conflict never getting anywhere. And then both people having a ton of anxiety about that. So the pursuer feels a ton of anxiety. We're not going to get anywhere. We need to talk about this. I want us to fix what's happening. And the other person is feeling an opposite form of anxiety, which is, yeah, we're not going to get anywhere. this conversation is going to make it worse. I just want us to shut up so that we stop fighting. And so obviously that becomes very destructive because you have two people that are essentially constantly moving in the opposite direction of each other and not doing what the other person needs. A really productive way to step out of that is to actually do the opposite. So for the person who's the pursuer, to learn to lay back a little bit and to say, all right, I'm not going to bring up the issue. And we're just going to kind of have to like wait for a little bit and see what happens. I'm not saying you wait for 6 months to see what happens, but you hang back a little. And for the other person to really work on pulling themselves forward and saying, you know, I know that I shut us down last night. This morning, I'm going to sit down and talk to you, even though I don't want to. I'm going to do it because I know it's important. The third dynamic is freeze and flee. And so that is when couples are completely shut down. So both of them have had that anxiety for a while and they give up. And the image that I think of is just a couple that's like back to back in bed and they're both like looking at their phones and no one is communicating anymore, you know, and they're upset about something and people are like sighing, but they're not saying anything. And so that is the third destructive dynamic that couples can get into.
Yeah, it's like heartbreaking. I can see how it progresses to there. Just, you know, I don't know if there's like gender roles at play, but like the pursuer would be like, let's fix this, the mom, or like the female, I would feel like that person, you know, is taught to talk about things a lot more than like maybe sharing emotions. And I thinking about just like how some boys were raised back in the day, like to not want to talk about things and to shut down. Do you see that there are those gender roles at play, or is it kind of just depends on the couple?
Yeah, so definitely depends on the couple, of course. There are certainly, I've worked with many couples where the male partner is the pursuer and the female partner is like, shut down. I don't want to talk to you. Leave me alone. But what I will say is that it tends to be the female partner who is in the pursuer position, and it tends to be the male partner who is in the distancing position. And you're absolutely correct. It comes from the socialization. So we have meta emotion mismatches in male-female relationships, stereotypically. And what that means is that what we think about emotions is different. So women have been raised to think talking is nice. I mean, we have tea parties when we're little where we have all our little teddy bears and we're having conversations and we're saying, oh, you know, you look sad today. What's going on?
Right.
We're taught that we should think that feelings are good, that they're important. Yeah. Men are taught to think that feelings aren't helpful. They're given tool benches so that they can work things out and problem solve. And so you're having this mismatch where one partner is thinking, even if we don't come up with a solution, I just think that emotions are helpful to discuss. And I think that problems are helpful to discuss. And you have this other person who's saying, I don't think that's helpful to discuss. What I think is helpful is to just have a flipping solution. Like, what do you want to do? You don't like the living room? All right, let's rip the carpet out. Like, what's the problem?
Right.
And then you have the female partner saying, well, it's not about that. It's that I wanted to talk about how X, Y, and Z is happening. And so, yeah, there's very often gender dynamic in that.
Wow. So you mentioned humor as a way to get out of the blame game. I am thankful for Chris's humor. Definitely it's just fun. And I don't know how we get through some of the hard stuff we've been through without it. But what are some strategies other than humor, if that's not your thing, or, you know, what are some strategies to kind of get through some of these common patterns or to stop them in their tracks?
Yeah. So humor is a huge strategy, but like you said, it's not for everyone. And so if someone's listening and they're thinking, oh my God, I'd be so angry if my partner made a joke when I'm upset, like it would never work. That's completely normal. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling that way. It's really important that couples sit down and talk about what works for them. You know, if humor works for you, then do it. But if it doesn't, you need to tell your partner, honey, I know when you're using humor, it's to help me. It does not help me. Let's try something else.
Yeah.
The way you can think about what helps is think about the skills that help us to be relational. Now, when we are flooded or overwhelmed in conflict, we lose our relationship skills because they're not really important for survival. Which is kind of silly, right? Because we actually do need our friends in our village. But like in the moment when we're fighting the lion, we don't need to make a joke. We don't need to give a hug. We don't need any of those things. So if you can think about when I'm not fighting the lion, what are the things I can do with my partner? I can hug. I can joke. I can apologize. I can ask questions. I can lower my voice and be calm and breathe. I can ask for a break. So all of those types of things can be really helpful in the conflict because they signal to the other person on a very physical level. This isn't cognitive, signals to their body that they're safe. So if you're in an argument with someone and you lower your voice, the other person feels that and their fight or flight response starts to let up because they're like, oh, I'm safe. I can be calm too. I can be here with you. That's why humor works, because my husband wouldn't be joking with me if our house was burning down, right? Mm-hmm. So the second that my body senses humor, it knows, oh, this must be a safe encounter, because nobody would be joking if this was a dangerous encounter. And so anything that signals safety can help us to de-escalate.
I love that. I've been in the kids relationship world for a while because I have young children, and it's interesting because I'm sure this parallels and mirrors adult relationships. But what was interesting about how we should be communicating with our kids is like never teaching them in the moment of when they feel flooded. It's like taking a beat and waiting and then coming back to it and saying, this is what happened. You're telling the story. This is how you felt. So those feelings are validated. This is what we'll do next time. But now it's just applying it to my adult life to take a beat or wait until we're not feeling those feelings. Okay. I love speaking, taking a breath and speaking more quietly. Yeah. I like humor too. I'm just not as good as it is, Chris.
Oh yeah. My husband is so good. I'm not that good at it. So I try it. Like the joke goes like over my husband's.
Yeah.
Like, was that a joke? I'm like, yeah, wasn't it funny?
It was trying to be a joke. Okay, great. So when it comes to maybe couples in the freeze and flee or the pursuer roles, like when do you recommend, because you're demystifying therapy a lot of your work is talking about couples therapy and how it can be supportive. When should a couple engage in therapy and when's the right time?
There's so many moments that can be effective. So proactively, I work with a lot of couples, and we're actually noticing a trend of millennial couples going to therapy before there's a problem. And so they go in because they really want to be able to learn skills. They want to understand each other more deeply, and they just want to be ahead of the game. It's starting to become like a more holistic part of the way they take care of their health. And so if you're in that stage, I suggest, premarital counseling before you get married. I suggest before you have a baby that you sit down with somebody and you talk about your expectations and your hopes and your triggers and what you need for support, really during any big life transition. I suggest that. But of course, a lot of people also go when there's a lot going on and there's conflict, or there's loss or grief or indecisiveness. And couples therapy can really help with any of those spots in your relationship, because it's about helping you to understand who you are, who your partner is, and then developing skills to improve the relationship.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you bring that up. I just hosted a shower at my house, and one of my girlfriends said, yeah, I was at therapy with my husband and we were just kind of talking about, so I'm also demoing a house and she's building one. And she's like, so we actually had a whole session around like our stress and anxiety about like, who's going to manage it? Who's going to manage the contractors? How are we going to do this? We have 3 young kids. We both work, like kind of creating a plan for that. And I was like, would have been helpful for us. Like it's just, I am seeing that with my friends, just this very proactive approach to it. It can be so supportive just to make the space. In my world, it's making the space to lightly meal prep or throw your veggies in your fridge, or to sit down and talk to your counterpart or your husband or your wife or your partner or your roommate of like, how are you going to schedule time for your workout and movement and what's important to you and your priorities? It's really refreshing to see it in the relationship space, whether it's couples relationships or relationships with children. Like it's really coming into focus now more than ever. And I really love it.
Yeah, it is really great to see people wanting to pay attention to that because relationships impact us on such a significant level. And I actually am launching a new company in April called Ours. We were kind of talking about that a little bit before we started. And the whole purpose of the company is proactive relationship care. So I love that you said like the house demoing, our ultimate goal is things like that where couples can come in before they're fixing their house to talk about what they need to talk about, or roommates can come in before they're moving in together so that they can explore how to make sure their relationship stays honest and healthy and respectful. And it's been really exciting to see how many people want that. Like anytime I talk about it, they're like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have had that before we had our baby or before I moved in or before we bought a house or whatever.
Yeah, these big life changes can really bring things up and they can be stressful. So relationship respect and communication is so key and important.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your book because not everyone is going to feel comfortable proactively going to therapy. You're making it more accessible with Ours, but let's talk about I Want This to Work. What inspired you to write this book and what can people expect?
Yeah, so a couple things inspired me to write the book. One thing that inspired me was that a lot of people don't go to couples therapy. There is some stigma against it. It's expensive, it's time consuming. People with little kids, it's really hard to find babysitters. And so I wanted to create a resource that would be a good starting point so that people had an opportunity to read something, to have conversations, to build skills, even if they couldn't go into the therapy room. The second reason I wrote it is because when I am working with couples in the therapy room, there are a lot of different books. And when I would recommend books so that they could get more information on a specific topic, it felt really overwhelming because every week they'd be like, well, can I get more information on attachment styles? And I'd be like, sure, read Attached. It's an amazing book. Or can we get more information on this kind of communication? Well, yeah, you have to read this whole book. And nobody's reading that many books and going to couples therapy and all of that. So I wanted to create like a very concise book that was full of all of those points that I hit on in therapy, but that you could just read a chapter on it and not an entire book. And then the third reason, which is really close to my heart, is that I was working with a lot of couples who were same-sex couples or couples that had, they were different racial or background makeups. And what was happening was I would recommend books to them. And this was early in my career. And they would come back and say, I don't see myself in this book at all. And one thing that, I'm embarrassed to admit maybe is that I didn't even notice that back then. I would read these top books and, oh my gosh, this book's amazing. And I would offer it to a same-sex couple. And then these couples I was working with would come in and be like, it's a great book, but there's not one same-sex couple in any of these examples throughout the book. And so I remember like in my first year of practice that happening a lot. And I was like, this isn't okay. And it's just unnecessary. These things apply and we really need to help people see themselves within these types of books. And so that was my third goal with this book.
That's wonderful. An inclusive guide for people to be able to see themselves in the relationships examples you're giving and breaking down whether it's attachment style or relationship patterns and how to strategies to get the cliff notes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, can we talk a little bit about attachment styles and what you see in your practice?
Yeah, so attachment styles are really popular right now, and people really identify with their attachment styles these days. But something that I think is really important for people to know is that our attachment styles change throughout our lifetime. And so when I do see people who are having some attachment style stuff come up, often with that pursuer distancer dynamic I talked about, right? You can see that there'd be the more anxiously attached person and the more avoidant person kind of being in that dynamic. I really like to remind them that this can change, and it can change as soon as your relationship starts to feel safe. And so as we build skills to do that, you're going to find that you don't lean into that avoidant go-to that you might usually do. And you don't lean into being as maybe frenetic and pursuant as you usually are because you feel safe. Attachment styles are really about how anxious do you feel within relationships? How anxious do you feel about connecting? So I dislike that anxious attachment style is called anxious attachment style because avoidants are also anxious. It just shows up differently. Avoidants are anxious that you're going to suffocate me. We're going to fight. I'm not going to have a say, whatever. And people who are, quote, anxiously attached, they are anxious that they are going to be abandoned, that the relationship is going to end, all of those types of things. When you create a safe relationship, anxiety can be released. And so that's really the work of being able to move through that.
Well, you gave us some tools on how to make a communication feel safe. That was hugging, apologizing, taking a deep breath, lowering your voice, using humor, trying to be calm. Are there ways to proactively create safety in a relationship that aren't in response to an argument or conflict?
Yeah. So one of the biggest ways that couples create safety in relationships is to create rituals. And so something that shows up across all relationship sciences, any of the top researchers, is that we really need reliability in our relationships to feel safe. So if you have a partner who is reliable, which means that you can kind of predict who they are day to day, not all the time, we all have bad moods and stuff, but you can predict who they are. You can predict when you're going to talk. You can predict when you're going to connect. That creates safety and security. And so when you create rituals with your partner, you are proactively creating a space that feels safe and good and healthy for you. There are two types of rituals. Some are the rituals that are created organically, which means that you didn't even think about them, but they happen every single day. So for example, I give my husband a kiss as soon as we wake up every morning. We never discussed that. I didn't say, hey, to have a good relationship, do you want to kiss every morning? But we do it. And if it didn't happen, what would I feel? I would feel so anxious, right? Like, oh my God, is he mad at me? Like, what's going on? Are we not in sync anymore? And so I rely on that. It shows me our relationship is safe. We also have inorganic rituals, which are fantastic to have too. And these are things where you might say to your partner, the kids keep us really busy. We're not having enough time together. I think we have to schedule a date. I think we have to schedule every Sunday morning. We check in with each other about what upset us this week, what's going well this week, but really kind of creating that ritual is then something you can rely on as well.
It's interesting because prior to kids, we had so many organic rituals. Like Chris would fill my cup of coffee for me. He's always great with the coffee. He makes it the night before, but it's always like making and giving me my coffee. Or like when we would get ready to go out on a date, like we'd jam ourselves into our small apartment bathroom together, even though it wasn't like, take your turn. It was like, let's do this. We're getting ready. We wait till the last minute. We both do it. And it was like this time where we would do a lot of talking. He'd be doing his hair. I'd be doing my makeup. And we'd be just like downloading each other on like everything from the day or like, just there. And then there's those kitchen conversations where I'm cooking and he just like ponies up and throws his butt on the counter and just like wants to be in my space and talk to me. And you then start having children and it's like someone needs to be fed and someone's crying and and it is interesting because you are moving into where we didn't ever have to have inorganic rituals where I want this to work. Like I want this to work. I want us to be happy and thriving and growing. And so these inorganic rituals become more a part of the conversation of like, can we have a check-in or can we schedule date night and get my mom to help, whatever the case may be. Do you see that that's part of like normal life or how do you suggest clients create these inorganic rituals or when?
Oh, I love that you brought up how it's really common to lose the organic rituals when you have kids. And when I'm working with clients in that phase of their relationship, sometimes there will be a lot of resistance to the idea that they have to be inorganic, right? So there will be a lot of, we used to connect more, you used to pay more attention to me, you used to do X, Y, and Z. And something I try to normalize is like, yes, you used to, because your life was very different.
So different.
Like you still have the same number of hours in the day, but you have like 8 million more responsibilities. So like, no, your partner isn't necessarily going to be able to like sit on the counter with you every night because they might be doing the baths, and that has to work while that's going on. And the first thing I try to push people on is like, please stop resisting that it's inorganic. People, oh, they should want to do it. We shouldn't have to plan so much. It's normal to have to reassess when your life shifts, and to be able to sit down together and say, you know what, our life doesn't have room for the spontaneity anymore. That is a reality. Like, let's not fault each other for that. That would be a silly thing for us to fight about. And instead, let's think about, what are we missing because we don't have the spontaneity? Well, I miss my conversations with you. I miss our hot dates. I miss cuddling. Okay, great. It can't be spontaneous right now, but I can promise you that I'll cuddle with you every single night before I go to bed for 30 minutes. Or I can promise you I'll ask my mom if she can come by every Saturday and you and I can sit and talk. So looking at what you miss about what it used to be and then trying to create it now in a way that makes sense takes all that shame and that anger and that frustration out of the conversation and helps you come up with a real solution.
So good. It's so good. And I'm telling you, as a mom of toddlers, the inorganic stuff, like, it just goes back to being a mom, a wife, an entrepreneur. It's like, if it's not scheduled sometimes for me, like, it doesn't get to happen. And I used to be so spontaneous, so free with my schedule, and felt really proud of the fact that I just like fly by the seat of my pants. But when you have so many more balls that you're juggling, when it doesn't happen, you just feel worse.
It's so true. Yeah, it's so true.
So other than rituals, what else can we do to create safety in a relationship?
Working on ourselves, super important. So you're safe, you create safety in your relationship when you are acting like you are a safe person to be in a relationship with, right? And so a lot of the time we will wait for another person to do things so we feel happier, and we really lose the self-focus. And I've seen this really explode on like Instagram recently. It's very point fingers, right? They need to do this, they're this diagnosis, they're X, Y, like everybody's the bad guy except for me. And if you want a safe relationship, you have to work on being safe, and you have to work on being safe for yourself, which means you take care of yourself, you have boundaries, you do all of those types of things. And you have to be safe for the other person, which means pay attention to your triggers, take responsibility when you lose it. Sometimes you take responsibility when you've been withdrawn. The thing is that when you're being safe with yourself, you're also going to be less likely to put up with it if somebody else is creating a dynamic that is tumultuous and like not making you happy, right? Because you're going to have that insight. So super important to create safety within you.
Such a good point. I mean, when you're talking about it, like, I'm imagining when I do yoga, I'm a better wife, I'm a better mom, I'm more centered, I'm more calm, I have a longer fuse. When I, have some food in the fridge, or I know what's planned for dinner, I'm not playing the blame game. I'm not, acting like it should be someone else's responsibility. It's like, I know I'm taken care of. It's the airplane oxygen mask on yourself first before someone else. But it makes perfect sense for me. So when you see couples, how, like, say Chris and I come to see you, how do you first try to understand them individually, and then as a couple, like, what questions are you asking? What can we be asking ourselves in our relationships?
Such a good question. So when I meet with people, I meet with them together first. And one of my favorite things to ask them to do is to take me through the history of their relationship. So tell me the ups and downs. And couples love that conversation. And it also gives me a really good assessment of how far down the road of conflict they are. Because when couples are in a really bad place, the entire history is bad, right? So they'll say, well, when we met, like, I guess it was fine, but we were both drunk. And I don't know, I probably should have known then that I shouldn't have liked them. And then we had this hard time moving into our apartment. And then we did this, and then we did that. Everything's like bad. When couples are still in like an okay place, they have both. So they can say things like, oh my gosh, it was such a nightmare when we moved into our first apartment. The moving people stole all of our stuff, and our security security deposit bounced. And oh my gosh, it was terrible. But it was really, really fun because we had to sleep on the floor for a week. And I remember that being really playful. And so one thing couples can do at home is they can sit down and talk to each other like, hey, what do you remember about our past? And work to be really cognizant that you're bringing up the positive memories as much as you're bringing up the difficulties. And we know that couples who are in a healthy place with each other, they will use the word but after a negative memory. So they'll say things like, yeah, oh my God, that first house we lived in was disgusting. I hated it. But you know what? You made it beautiful, honey. You did a good job with that. And so listening to yourself and how you talk about your past can really help you to assess where you are now. And then being able to push yourself to think, I'm looking back through these like either rose colored or gray colored glasses, but can I push myself to see the reality a little bit more? Like, what was I liking at that time? Or how did we get through that? What's our resilience? What are our strengths? So that's a really fun conversation to have. Another thing that I talk to people about is what it is that they do when they're in an argument, what they notice happening in their bodies. It's always a huge aha moment for couples to hear their partner share this, because we see just the output of what's happening. So, if somebody said, what happens to Andrew when you're arguing? I'd say, oh, he gets shut down. He doesn't talk to me. Da, 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 da. But when he says in a conversation, well, when we're arguing, I feel overwhelmed. I feel like I don't know what to say. I feel like you're attacking me, whatever it is. That helps me to understand the inner part of who he is when he is upset. And so couples who can talk about that, hey, what's going on when we're upset inside? That's an incredibly powerful moment. And then it also gives us an understanding of what skills for coping need to be built so that that no longer happens.
The example you just gave of you and Andrew is, I think, mirrors Chris and I. And looking at him, I'll see it, if we are in conflict, I'll see him take a deep breath and he'll sigh, and which I know, like the health person in me, and the nutritionist knowing about breathing and how important that is, will know like he's holding his breath, like he's physically holding his breath and taking a sigh, and he doesn't even realize it's like a audible sigh sometimes. What are some coping mechanisms and ways to, you gave us the safety, and I'm going to use that. I probably sound like the pursuer right now. Maybe I am. But I just want to talk about it all the time. I want to talk about everything. I want to work through everything. I will say though, that what a relief to hear you say that you have couples talk about their relationship, because I do feel so rosy when I think about like our first small rent controlled apartment and, things that have, even just looking back on some of our biggest traumas, like Sebastian's birth and being in the NICU, and remembering, Chris and I talk that sometimes our traumas feel a little bit like our mini versions of 9/11, where it's so scary and so intense and so hard and lots of tears or emotions, but that we do feel like we come together, like that aftermath that people felt in New York of like community and being there for one another and like smiling at people on the streets. And I do feel that way in our relationship, even though like some of the stuff is really, really traumatic or hard, or we're in it. At the end of it, it does feel like most of the time we come closer together, which is a relief. Because I think if you were to ask me that story, I'd be like, it was great. Now it's really hard with 2 little kids and a business and a mortgage. But that back then, that was a breeze and we had so much fun. Like, how do we keep the fun? Right. But I obviously don't want him to feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed if I'm wanting to talk about things all the time. And I do feel like for him, if I bring things up, I think he thinks I think that our relationship isn't great or something, like I finding problems, or what kind of advice would you give to maybe women or maybe men who have things to talk about and want to talk about things all the time?
Yeah. So I suggest actually just saying some of the things you just said,
They
right?
can listen
And
to this podcast. Yeah.
past, but proactively, not in the moment where you're wanting to talk. Because if you go and you sit down and you say, I really want to talk about this thing, but you know about them is that they're going to code that as, oh my God, I've done something wrong. There's a problem. I can never get it right. That's not the moment you're going to say, oh no, I just really want you to listen to me. I mean, you can do that then too, but it's not going to internalize. But at just like a random moment, being able to say, something I've noticed, using that language is really helpful. Something I've noticed is that I, in the relationship, love to talk about things. And that's just who I am. I'm that way with my friends. I'm that way in my own head constantly. I love to talk about things. I like to bring up like issues I'm having or feelings I'm having and da-da-da-da. And something I think I've noticed, so using that noticed word, is that that's just like not how you are. And that's completely fine. I'm curious, what is it like for you when I bring up stuff? Do you feel like, and I always suggest like give people options to pick from, especially people who aren't talkative. Like you don't have to give me options because I'll know what I want to say. But people who aren't talkative, you can say something like, I'm just wondering, like when I bring this stuff up, are you thinking that I'm always upset? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you thinking it's like I'm drama? Are you thinking, like, what are you thinking, honey? And letting your partner talk about that. And then being able to, in that moment, say, well, look, I'm like narrating what your experience is. In those moments, it is not like the end of the world for me. I'm genuinely just wanting to chat. What would help you to remember that when I bring up something? Do you want me to tell you, like, no big deal, you don't have to solve a problem, it's just me chatting, but actually kind of proactively explore this with the other person?
I think that you're making a great point because we think our relationship is great and we've been together for so long, that sometimes the serious conversations are more like, this is an issue I'm worried about with our son, or this is an issue I'm worried about with us, or this is an issue I'm worried about for what X, Y, and Z. And so there aren't as many of those proactive conversations of like, hey, I really am so grateful for you for doing X, Y, and Z. And so maybe the narrative is like every time that we're talking, it's addressing or exploring what may not be positive. But where the breaks in between those conversations, I'm like, we're so great. This is awesome. I love you so much. And maybe not verbalizing it as much.
Which brings another important point to your question about how do we create safety. A really big way to create safety is to be talking about the good. People like to hear that they've done good. They want to know that they please you. They want to know that they're appreciated, that you're proud of them, that you admire them. And I'm not talking about doing it in a way that's not genuine. Like we don't need to just constantly make up false appreciations, but making sure that you're letting the other person know where you stand about them as often as you can.
Right. So important. Well, something you've noticed, and I know a reason why you wrote this book, is that you're finding that couples nowadays are determined to stay together and not get divorced. Can you talk a little bit about this? It makes me excited. I mean, especially with the divorce rate where it's at right now. What do you think the change is all about?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've noticed that, and I think that's why people are coming to couples therapy earlier and earlier, is that we have a generation of people who don't want to repeat what happened when they were growing up. It's very much coming from a place of, like, I wish my parents would have just like learned to not speak like that to each other when we were 3 years old. Like, why did this have to go on for 20 years? And then they got divorced. And when I get married, I'm going to do it from a place of being really assured and committed and this is something that I'm taking very seriously. And not that people in the past didn't take it seriously, but they had fewer tools, I think, to identify what would help them to improve their relationship. And so, yeah, many couples are coming in and they're very determined to do it right from the get go. And that's really, really beautiful. I think on the flip side of that is sometimes people might stay in relationships longer than they should. But the really positive of it is that we have a lot of people who are early on in their relationship navigating dynamics that if they had let them go on for 20 years would have been so toxic. But because they're dealing with it now, they're just learning how to live life together, and it's beautiful.
That's awesome. I love, just the proactive couples therapy. And your book came out of a workshop, right? A workshop that you would host with pregnant people and people in relationships. And each chapter has exercises. Is there an example of an exercise you haven't talked about other than creating safety that you think people should start implementing now so that they aren't repeating their parents' patterns for 20 years and then getting divorced?
Yeah. So each part of the book has lots of exercises. So there's individual exercises, there are conversation prompts so that you can bring your partner like into the book with you. But one exercise that I'm thinking about as we're talking, especially when I'm reflecting on the parents' generation, like what happened then, is the concept of internal boundaries. And so internal boundaries are the boundaries we have with ourselves. And I kind of alluded to them earlier. So that's saying, you know what, I could answer one more email, but I'm going to go to the bathroom. Or I could go in the kitchen and clean everything up, but I'm so thirsty. I'm going to drink something first. Or I could do one other thing for my kid, but I'm going to let them play on the floor for a second while I go do yoga. Internal boundaries are something that I think a lot of our parents didn't have. So what they would do is they would just give and give and give, and then they would resent. And we are the product of resentful parents. And it's very hard to watch resentful parents, right? Because one half, we have to split them. There's this one half where we're like, oh my God, they were the most loving mother. They were so fantastic. And then this other half where we're like, geez, why didn't you ever say no? Or like, why are you so mad at dad for that? You were the one who didn't you could have left and gone and done what you needed to do on Friday nights. Like nobody was stopping you. And so we have this like mixed experience of parents often who resent each other and resent their lives in some ways. And a really, really important thing that you could do for yourself so that you don't resent your relationship is to have a boundary with yourself that you're not going to constantly overextend. And so there's lots of exercises in the book that help you to do that. But the most basic is to think about one basic need that you're going to focus on all week. And whenever you notice that need coming up, you're going to say no to whatever else is happening. So your kid is like, I want one more snack. And you notice you have to pee. You're going to say, oh, well, I have to go pee now. I'll be back and we can talk about that in a little bit. You know, somebody calls you and you said that you're going to focus on drinking water. Say, well, I'm really thirsty right now. I'm not going to answer the phone until I go and drink water. It's like a very basic way to start practicing that muscle.
Wow. You just illustrated in my brain, like my childhood. And so I'm sure so many other people's my mom was so selfless. Like it was all about us. It was all about us. Consumed, I look at, and her mom was that way too. Like just taking care of her kids, not cutting out time for herself to say like, I am going to go do what I love. Like my mom was a photographer. She loved photography. I wish she would have spent more time doing it, but she made us her number one focus. And then when we all went to school, I think there's a void there in like not cultivating your own personal passions and hobbies. And I do find myself repeating that. I have mom guilt and mom shame of like, I'm going to go do yoga for myself, or I'm going to even run my business. Like it's the livelihood of our family, but like, but I know it's learned. Like I know I when I have conversations with doctors like you, like I know it's learned, and I know I don't think my mom had the tools or the example to teach her to create those boundaries so that she had a space for herself, that she was taking care of herself first, like you talked about earlier in today's podcast. And, I hope now, like I see her doing it now, like she'll go to Pilates, and she didn't work out when we were younger, and
I love that.
I'm so proud of her, or bunko or whatever it is, like seeing her girlfriends or having birthday lunches with her girlfriends. Like, I'm so proud of her for having this space for herself. I just wish she would have carved out some time earlier when we were younger.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. I see it's really interesting because my mother has started saying no more often. And I'm like, there's part of me that's like, no, what do you mean you can't come over and hang out like with my son for 30 minutes?
Yeah.
And then this other part of me is like, that's amazing. I'm so glad that you just said no because I have swim class. Like,
Yeah.
please go to swim class. I will handle it. But that is not something she had her entire life. And it's sad.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to her. Like, she is the sweetest, mushiest mother in the world.
Same.
But like, she didn't have all these like tools to be like, oh, internal boundaries. My kids will feel loved if I go to swim class for 30 minutes. It's okay. Like, she didn't have all that. She did the best she could, and it wasn't optimal. And so we can learn to do it a little bit differently. Take the good stuff. I totally want to be like my mom in so many ways.
Right.
And then work on the other things that you recognize didn't really help her or didn't help you even.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't have to be like a 2-hour hot yoga class and like coffee with your friend every day, but it's like, how does she get 20 to 30 minutes by herself, and like reframe what self-care looks like as a mom or as, a working entrepreneur or whatever it is, whatever your life is serving to you, really finding that space for yourself. And I'm so happy that you bring that up in your book and in your work, because, right, we have to be our whole self first before we're able to be in a healthy relationship. Oh my goodness. Well, I feel like I could talk to you forever, Liz. And obviously, selfishly, I'm bringing up my own personal life, but that's how I learn. And these strategies of creating safety in our relationships, working on ourselves, understanding who we are and our attachment style, but not blaming and really focusing on what we can do. These are the most productive and your new book, I Want This to Work, inclusive ways that we can all work on our relationships and not repeat the past. So thank you so much for your work and for being a voice and putting your platform out there as an education tool for all of us. Our generation wants to learn. We want to be better. We don't want to repeat the past, and you're making that happen for people. So thank you for putting the time into writing your book and putting information out on the internet every day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Where can people follow along? Where can they find you?
The easiest place is on Instagram. You can find me at Liz Listens. You can also use my name for my website, so ElizabethEarnshaw.com. And the book, I Want This to Work, is available everywhere books are sold. So anywhere you like to buy your books, you can just type it in and it'll pop up.
Buy two, make it a book club with your partner, and work on it together. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here. We'll put all the links in the show notes, and I'll be sharing this pod online.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at BeWellByKelly.com and follow me on Instagram at BeWellByKelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.